The winter storm hit the Montana Territory so fast that even the old-timers who claimed they could smell snow 3 days out were caught off guard. And by the time the wind started howling through the narrow mountain pass west of Helena, Patrick Irwin knew he had made a terrible mistake leaving the settlement that morning. The sky had turned the color of gunmetal, then pewter, then finally that peculiar yellow-white that meant nature was about to remind every living soul just how small and fragile they really were. Patrick pulled his coat tighter, but the wind cut through the wool like it was made of paper. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Flint, was already struggling through drifts that reached past his knees. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour, and the snow was coming down so thick Patrick could barely see 10 feet ahead. He had been riding the circuit between mining camps and small settlements, working as a cattle buyer and sometimes a courier when the money was good. It was December 1882, and he had spent the last 3 years building a reputation as a man who could be trusted with a deal and who knew how to handle himself when things went sideways. At 26, he had already lived more lives than most men twice his age. He had punched cattle in Texas, worked silver mines in Nevada, and even spent a year as a deputy marshal in a town so small it did not even have a name on most maps. But none of that experience meant a damn thing when you were caught in a blizzard in the mountains with darkness falling and the temperature still dropping. Patrick knew the signs of frostbite, knew how quickly a man could freeze to death out here. He had seen it happen before. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. The wind carried something then, a sound that did not belong to the storm. Patrick pulled Flint to a stop, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. A horse's whinny, high-pitched and frightened. And something else. A voice, maybe. A cry for help. Every instinct told Patrick to keep moving, to find shelter for himself before it was too late. The temperature was still dropping, and the snow was already deep enough that Flint was struggling with every step. But Patrick had never been good at listening to the sensible part of his brain, the part that kept most men alive. He turned Flint toward the sound and urged the horse forward. He found her about 50 yards off what passed for a trail, half buried in a snowdrift beside a roan mare that was favoring its left front leg. The woman was wearing a traveling coat that might have been adequate for a chilly autumn day, but was worse than useless against this kind of cold. She was trying to get the mare to move, but the animal was clearly injured and terrified, and the woman herself was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Patrick was off his horse before he had fully thought through what he was doing. The woman looked up at him with eyes that were the color of strong coffee, wide with cold and fear, and something that might have been relief or might have been resignation. Her lips were already turning blue, and her dark hair, which had probably been pinned up properly that morning, was coming loose and whipping around her face. "Can you ride?" Patrick asked, his voice rough from the cold and from not having spoken to another person in 2 days. "My horse," the woman said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. "She stepped in a hole. I cannot leave her. If you do not get out of this storm in the next 10 minutes, you are going to die," Patrick said flatly. "And then your horse is going to die anyway. Now can you ride or not?" The woman stared at him for a moment, and Patrick saw the exact instant when she realized he was right. She nodded just once, and Patrick grabbed her arm and practically threw her up onto Flint's back. The mare was watching them with frightened eyes, but Patrick could see the swelling in her left foreleg. The horse had probably pulled a tendon or worse. There was no way she was going to make it through this storm. Patrick took off his own coat and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, then swung up behind her. Flint snorted in protest at the extra weight, but the buckskin was a tough horse with good sense, and he leaned into the wind without having to be told. Patrick wrapped one arm around the woman's waist to keep her from falling, then took the reins with his other hand and turned Flint back toward what he hoped was the trail. The world had become nothing but white and wind and cold. Patrick could not feel his fingers anymore, and he was starting to lose feeling in his feet. The woman in front of him was still shaking, but at least she was conscious. He could feel her breathing, fast and shallow, and he tightened his grip on her waist. "What is your name?" he asked, partly because he wanted to keep her talking and partly because if they were going to die out here together, he wanted to know who she was. "Lillian," she managed to say. "Lillian Zimmerman." "Patrick Irwin," he said. "Hold on, Lillian, just hold on." He had been hoping to find one of the lined shacks that dotted these mountains. Small cabins built by ranchers for their cowboys to use during the spring and fall roundups. There was supposed to be one about a mile from where they had been, but Patrick was no longer sure they were even heading in the right direction. The storm had turned the landscape into something alien and hostile, and every snowdrift looked the same. Flint stumbled, then caught himself, and Patrick felt a surge of fear that was worse than the cold. If the horse went down, that was it. They were done. But Flint kept going, one step at a time, and then suddenly there was something dark looming out of the white. A shape. A structure. The line shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, maybe 12 feet on a side, with a single small window and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. But it had walls and a roof, and that was enough. Patrick half fell off Flint's back, pulling Lillian down with him, and together they stumbled to the door. It was not locked, just stuck from the cold, and Patrick had to shoulder it hard twice before it finally gave way. Inside was dark and not much warmer than outside, but at least the wind was not trying to tear the skin off their faces. Patrick could make out the shape of a small cast iron stove in one corner, and what looked like a wooden bunk against one wall. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove, dry and ready, and Patrick said a silent prayer of thanks to whatever cowboy had left it there. "Sit down," he told Lillian, guiding her toward the bunk. "I need to get a fire started." His fingers were so numb he could barely strike a match, and it took him 3 tries before he got one lit. The kindling in the stove was old but dry, and it caught quickly. Patrick added larger pieces of wood, nursing the flame, and slowly the fire began to grow. Heat started to spread through the tiny cabin, and Patrick could finally start to feel his hands again, which meant they started to hurt. He turned to check on Lillian and felt his stomach drop. She was sitting on the bunk, still wrapped in his coat, but she had stopped shaking. That was bad. That meant she was past the point of shivering, which meant her body was shutting down. Her lips were still blue, and her skin had taken on a waxy quality that Patrick recognized. He moved fast, pulling blankets down from a shelf he had not noticed before. There were only 2, and they smelled like dust and mouse droppings, but they were thick wool, and that was what mattered. Patrick wrapped one around Lillian's shoulders, then started unlacing her boots. They were soaked through, and her stockings were wet against her feet. He pulled them off despite her weak protests, then wrapped her feet in part of the second blanket. "I need to get Flint," he said, more to himself than to her. "I will be right back." He went back out into the storm, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. Flint was standing right where Patrick had left him, head down against the wind, ice already forming on his mane. Patrick led the horse around to the side of the cabin, where there was a small lean-to that would at least provide some shelter from the worst of the wind. He pulled off Flint's saddle and the saddlebags, rubbing the horse down as best he could with a handful of straw he found in the corner, then made sure the horse had access to the snow for water. "You are a good horse," Patrick told Flint, running his hand down the buckskin's neck. The best horse. Back inside the cabin, Patrick added more wood to the fire and checked on Lillian again. She was starting to shiver now, which was actually a good sign. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him with something like awareness. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where else would I go?" Patrick asked. He unwrapped the second blanket from his own shoulders, the one he had been planning to use for himself, and added it to the layers covering Lillian. "You need to get warm. That is all that matters right now." "You are going to freeze," Lillian said. "I will be fine," Patrick lied. The truth was he was already shaking again, and the fire, while growing, was not putting out enough heat to warm the whole cabin. The temperature outside was still dropping, and the wind was finding every crack and gap in the walls. Patrick could see his breath in the air, even with the fire going. He sat down on the floor next to the bunk, as close to the stove as he could get without actually climbing inside it. He could feel exhaustion pulling at him, which was dangerous. Falling asleep in this cold could mean not waking up. He needed to stay alert, keep the fire going, make sure Lillian did not slip into hypothermia. "Patrick," Lillian said from the bunk. Her voice was stronger now, more focused. "You gave me both blankets. You needed them more. You are going to die." "I have been through worse," Patrick said, which was not quite true but not quite a lie either. "Take one of the blankets back." "No. Patrick, I am not going to lie here and watch you freeze to death because you were stupid enough to be noble." Despite everything, Patrick felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Stupid enough to be noble. That might be the best description of me anyone has ever come up with." "I am serious," Lillian said. She sat up, moving stiffly, and started to unwrap one of the blankets from her shoulders. "Stop," Patrick said. "You are still half frozen." "So are you." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Patrick saw the determination in Lillian's eyes. She was not going to back down, which meant they were both going to end up cold and miserable instead of just one of them. Unless. "There is another option," Patrick said slowly. "We could share the blankets, pool our body heat." Lillian's eyes widened slightly, and Patrick felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am not suggesting anything improper," he said quickly. "Just that it is the warmest option. Purely practical." Lillian studied him for another moment, then nodded. "Purely practical," she repeated. Patrick stood up and moved to the bunk, sitting down carefully on the edge. Lillian moved over to make room, and Patrick lay down beside her, putting his back against the wall so there would be a gap between them. Lillian pulled the blankets over both of them, and immediately Patrick could feel the difference. The trapped air between them began to warm, and the layers of wool held it close. They lay there in awkward silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle in the stove. Patrick tried to keep a respectful distance, but the bunk was narrow, and eventually he had to admit that Lillian had been right. If they were going to do this, they might as well do it properly. He moved closer, fitting his body against hers, and wrapped his arm over her waist. He felt Lillian tense for a moment, then relax. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming back for me, for not leaving me out there." "I was not going to leave you," Patrick said. "Why not? You do not know me. I could be anyone." Patrick thought about that. She was right. He knew nothing about Lillian Zimmerman, except that she had been out in a blizzard with an injured horse, and that she had been willing to argue with him about blankets even when she was half frozen. But somehow that seemed like enough. "Maybe that is exactly why," he said. "You needed help. I could provide it. It does not have to be more complicated than that." "Most people would not see it that way," Lillian said. "Most people would have kept riding." "Then I guess I am not most people." Lillian was quiet for a moment, then said, "What were you doing out here, before you found me?" "Working," Patrick said. I buy cattle for some of the bigger ranches, ride circuit between the settlements. I was heading back to Helena when the storm hit. You are a cattle buyer, among other things. I have done a bit of everything. You learn to adapt out here or you do not last long. And where are you from originally? Texas, Patrick said. Left home when I was 18, never looked back. You, Pennsylvania, Lillian said. Philadelphia, I came west 6 months ago. That is a long way to travel. What brought you out here? Lillian was quiet for so long that Patrick thought maybe she had fallen asleep. Then she said, I was supposed to get married. Everything was arranged. Good family, good prospects, everything my parents wanted. Was supposed to. He was 43 years old and already on his third wife, Lillian said, and Patrick could hear the bitterness in her voice. The first two died in childbirth. He was looking for number 3 and my father owed him money. It seemed like a good solution, for everyone except me. So you ran. I ran, Lillian confirmed. I had some money saved and I bought a train ticket west. I thought maybe I could start over, find work, build a life that was actually mine. What kind of work? I was a teacher back in Philadelphia, Lillian said. I thought maybe I could teach out here. I heard some of the mining towns were looking for school teachers. They are, Patrick said. Good teachers are hard to come by. Most people who come west are looking to get rich, not to educate children. You could probably find work in half a dozen places. If I survive this storm, Lillian said. You will, Patrick said. We both will. This will blow over by morning and then we will head back to Helena. I know people there. We will get you sorted out. Why are you helping me? Lillian asked. Really? Patrick thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated, bound up in things he did not like to think about too much. His own past, his own mistakes, the people he had not been able to help. But maybe the truth was also simple. Because someone should, he said finally. Because you deserve to be helped. Because leaving you out there to die was not an option I could live with. Lillian turned her head slightly, and Patrick realized how close they were. He could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could count the freckles scattered across her nose. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that had nothing to do with careful grooming or expensive clothes. It was something in her face, in the set of her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes. Thank you, she said again, and this time her voice was soft with something that might have been emotion. They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, more comfortable. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin was growing warmer. Patrick could feel himself starting to relax, could feel the exhaustion of the day catching up with him. He knew he should get up, add more wood to the fire, make sure they would stay warm through the night. But Lillian was warm against him, and the blankets were heavy and soft, and it was so tempting to just close his eyes for a moment. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew he was waking up to find the cabin much darker. The fire had burned down to coals, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. Patrick carefully extracted himself from the blankets, ignoring Lillian's sleepy protest, and moved to the stove. He added more wood, stirring the coals until the new logs caught, then checked the pile of firewood. They had enough to last the night, but not much more than that. Patrick went to the small window and tried to peer out through the frost that had formed on the glass. It was still snowing, but he thought maybe not as hard as before. The wind had died down somewhat. Maybe by morning the worst would be past. He went back to the bunk and carefully climbed back under the blankets. Lillian moved closer immediately, seeking his warmth, and Patrick wrapped his arms around her. She made a small sound of contentment and settled against him, and Patrick felt something shift in his chest. Something warm and unexpected and maybe a little bit dangerous. He barely knew this woman. They had met only hours ago, under the worst possible circumstances. But lying here in the dark with her in his arms felt right in a way Patrick could not explain. Like maybe this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Morning came slowly, with gray light filtering through the frosted window. The storm had finally stopped, leaving behind a world buried under several feet of fresh snow. Patrick woke first, untangling himself from Lillian and the blankets as carefully as he could. She stirred but did not wake, and Patrick took a moment to just look at her. In sleep, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Her dark hair was spread across the thin pillow, and her face was peaceful. Patrick added more wood to the fire, then pulled on his boots and coat and went outside to check on Flint. The buckskin was standing in the lean-to, covered in a thin layer of frost, but otherwise looking remarkably unbothered by the whole experience. Patrick brushed the ice off the horse's coat and wished he had some feed to offer, but the saddlebags had only held a few supplies meant for human consumption. "We will get you back to civilization today," Patrick promised the horse. "Get you some proper feed and a warm stable." When he went back inside, Lillian was awake and sitting up on the bunk, wrapped in both blankets. Her hair was still loose around her shoulders, and Patrick thought she looked like something from a painting. "Good morning," she said, and there was something almost shy in her voice. "Morning," Patrick replied. "Storm passed. We should be able to make it back to Helena today if we start soon." "What about my horse?" Patrick hesitated, then decided honesty was better than false hope. "I will ride back out here once the trails are clear and see if I can find her." But Lillian, that was a bad injury, and she was standing out in that storm all night. Lillian's face fell, and Patrick saw tears gather in her eyes. She was a good horse. She did not deserve that. "No," Patrick agreed. "She did not. I am sorry." They ate a sparse breakfast of hardtack and jerky from Patrick's saddlebags, washed down with snow melted over the fire. It was not much, but it was enough to get them moving. Lillian braided her hair, though without pins or ribbon she could not do much more than tie it off with a piece of twine Patrick had in his gear. She looked at him, then at the single horse outside. "We are both going to ride Flint again," she asked. "Unless you want to walk," Patrick said. "It is about 15 miles back to Helena." "Flint does not mind. Flint is the best horse in Montana Territory," Patrick said. "He will get us there." They left the line shack as they had found it, with the door closed and a neat stack of firewood by the stove for the next person who might need shelter. Patrick helped Lillian up onto Flint's back, then swung up behind her. It felt natural now, this closeness. His arm around her waist, her body warm against his chest. The ride back to Helena took most of the day. The snow was deep, and Flint had to pick his way carefully. They passed the place where Patrick had found Lillian the day before, but there was no sign of the roan mare. Just endless white snow and dark trees and mountains rising in the distance. They talked as they rode, sharing pieces of their lives. Patrick told Lillian about growing up in Texas, about the ranch where he had learned to ride and rope and work cattle. About his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one, and his mother, who had died when Patrick was 12. About the restlessness that had driven him west, the need to see what was over the next horizon. Lillian told him about Philadelphia, about a childhood spent in drawing rooms and at tea parties, learning to be a proper lady. About the books she had read in secret, the dreams she had nurtured of a different kind of life. About the terror of realizing that her father was going to sell her off to a man old enough to be her grandfather, and the wild courage it had taken to step onto that train heading west with nothing but a small bag and her savings. "You regret it?" Patrick asked. "Coming west?" "I almost died yesterday," Lillian pointed out. "But you did not." "No," she said slowly. "I did not, because of you, so no regrets." Lillian was quiet for a moment, then said, "No, No regrets. Even if things do not work out the way I hoped, at least I tried. At least I chose this for myself. They reached Helena as the sun was setting, turning the snow-covered streets gold and pink. It was a bustling town, having grown rapidly with the gold and silver strikes in the nearby mountains. The main street was lined with businesses: a general store, a bank, several saloons, a hotel, a church. People were out shoveling snow and going about their business, and the sound of a piano drifted from one of the saloons. Patrick guided Flint to the livery stable, where a man named Tom greeted them with raised eyebrows. "Irwin," Tom said. "Heard you might have gotten caught in that storm. Glad to see you made it." "Barely," Patrick admitted, dismounting and then helping Lillian down. "This is Miss Zimmerman. We need to get her set up with a room at the hotel." "I can pay," Lillian said quickly. "I have money." "I am sure you do," Patrick said, "but let me do this. You can pay me back later if you want." Tom took Flint with promises of a good rub-down and extra feed, and Patrick walked with Lillian to the hotel. It was a modest establishment, but clean and respectable. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Henderson, took in Lillian's disheveled appearance with barely concealed curiosity, but was too polite to ask questions. "Bath water is extra," Mrs. Henderson said as she handed over a key. "And we serve dinner at 6 and breakfast at 7. "Thank you," Lillian said. Patrick walked Lillian up to her room, a small space at the end of the hall with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the street. It was plain but serviceable, and Lillian looked at it like it was a palace. "Thank you," she said to Patrick, "for everything. I do not know how to repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Patrick said. "I am just glad you are safe." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, and Patrick realized he did not want to leave. He wanted to stay here, keep talking to this woman who had somehow become important to him in the space of a single night. But that was crazy. They barely knew each other, and Patrick had his own life, his own responsibilities. "I should let you rest," he said finally. "But if you need anything, I am staying at a boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Miller's place. Anyone can tell you where it is." "Thank you," Lillian said again. Then, impulsively, she reached up and kissed him on the cheek. "You saved my life, Patrick Irwin. I will not forget that." Patrick left before he could do something stupid, like kiss her back. He walked to Mrs. Miller's boarding house in a daze, his cheek still tingling where Lillian's lips had touched his skin. This was ridiculous. He was acting like a schoolboy with his first crush. He needed to get his head straight and focus on his work. But that night, lying in his narrow bed at the boarding house, Patrick could not stop thinking about Lillian. About the way she had fit against him under the blankets, the way she had looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes, the sound of her voice in the darkness. He had shared his last blanket with a stranger in a blizzard, and somehow in return, she had given him something he had not even known he was missing. Over the next few weeks, Patrick found himself spending more and more time with Lillian. It started innocently enough. He took her to meet the superintendent of schools, who was indeed looking for teachers, and was thrilled to find someone with Lillian's qualifications. There was a small school building on the edge of town, just one room but sturdy and well-maintained, and Lillian would start teaching after the new year. Patrick showed her around Helena, introducing her to the people he knew. The owner of the general store, who could order supplies from back east. The woman who ran the boarding house where several single teachers and nurses lived, a more appropriate place for Lillian than the hotel. The minister's wife, who was always looking for volunteers for various church activities. They took walks together when the weather allowed, trudging through snow-packed streets and talking about everything and nothing. Patrick learned that Lillian loved to read, that she had a sharp wit and a quicker temper, that she was more capable and independent than any woman he had ever met. Lillian learned that Patrick was quieter than he first appeared, that he thought carefully before speaking, that underneath his rough exterior was a man who cared deeply about doing the right thing. Christmas came, and Helena decorated itself with pine boughs and red ribbons. There was a dance at the town hall, and Patrick worked up the courage to ask Lillian if she would accompany him. She said yes with a smile that made Patrick's heart do something complicated in his chest. Lillian wore a dark green dress that brought out the gold in her eyes, and her hair was pinned up with small white flowers. Patrick had borrowed a proper suit from another boarding house resident, and he felt stiff and awkward in it. But when Lillian took his arm and smiled at him, none of that mattered. They danced, or at least they tried to. Patrick was not much of a dancer, but Lillian was patient with him, laughing when he stepped on her toes and teaching him the steps as they went. The town hall was warm and bright, filled with people Patrick had known for years, and some he was meeting for the first time. Everyone wanted to meet the new schoolteacher, and Lillian handled the attention with grace and humor. Later, when they stepped outside to cool off, Patrick found himself alone with Lillian under a sky full of stars. The air was cold but not bitterly so, and their breath made little clouds in the darkness. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," Lillian said. "I have not had this much fun in a long time." "Thank you for saying yes," Patrick replied. "I was not sure you would want to be seen with me." "Why would you think that? I am just a cowboy," Patrick said. "You are a teacher, an educated woman from a good family. We are from different worlds." "Maybe we were," Lillian said. "But that does not mean we have to stay there. I came west to build a new life, remember? To choose my own path. And right now, Patrick Irwin, I am choosing to spend time with you because I want to. Not because it is proper or expected, but because you make me happy." Patrick looked down at her, at this remarkable woman who had stumbled into his life during a blizzard and somehow turned everything upside down. He thought about the night in the line shack, about how right it had felt to hold her close. He thought about all the conversations they had shared, all the walks and dinners and quiet moments. He thought about how she made him laugh, how she challenged him to be better, how she had taken what could have been a tragedy and turned it into the beginning of something new. "Lillian," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I need you to know something. That night in the storm when I gave you my blanket, it was not just because it was the right thing to do. It was because even then, even when I barely knew you, I knew you were someone worth saving. Someone special." "Patrick," Lillian said softly. "And now, knowing you better, spending time with you, I realize I was right. You are special. You are smart and brave and funny and beautiful, and I know I have no right to say this, but I have fallen in love with you, Lillian Zimmerman. Completely and totally in love with you." Lillian stared at him, her eyes wide. For a terrible moment, Patrick thought he had made a horrible mistake, had moved too fast, ruined everything. Then Lillian smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. "You have fallen in love with me?" she asked. "Yes," Patrick said. "Good," Lillian said, "because I have fallen in love with you too." And then she kissed him properly this time, her arms around his neck and her body pressed close to his. Patrick wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her back, and it was better than anything he had ever imagined. She tasted like Christmas punch and smelled like pine and something floral, and Patrick thought that if he died right now, he would die a happy man. They pulled apart eventually, both breathing hard, both grinning like idiots. "So what do we do now?" Lillian asked. "I have some ideas," Patrick said, "but they all start with this." And he kissed her again. Over the next several months, Patrick and Lillian's relationship deepened and grew. Lillian started teaching at the school in January, and she was a natural at it. The children loved her, and even the most skeptical parents had to admit that Miss Zimmerman was exactly what the town needed. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but also history and geography and science. She organized spelling bees and recitations, and even put on a small play in March that had half the town in attendance. Patrick continued his work as a cattle buyer, but he found himself taking fewer and shorter trips. He wanted to be in Helena, wanted to be near Lillian. When he had to leave for a few days, he wrote her letters, long, rambling things about the places he was seeing and the people he was meeting and how much he missed her. Lillian wrote back, filling pages with stories about her students and observations about life in Helena and declarations of love that made Patrick's heart ache. In April, when the snow finally started to melt and the first green shoots began to appear, Patrick took Lillian on a picnic. They rode out to a spot he knew, a small valley where a creek ran clear and cold and wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. They sat on a blanket, eating fried chicken and biscuits that Mrs. Miller had packed for them, and talked about the future. "I have been thinking," Patrick said carefully, "about what comes next. For me, I mean." "What do you mean?" Lillian asked. "I have been buying cattle for other people for 3 years now," Patrick said, "and it is good work, honest work, but I have been saving money and I think I have enough to buy some land of my own, start a small ranch. Nothing huge, just enough to make a decent living." "That sounds wonderful," Lillian said. "There is land available not far from here," Patrick continued. 160 acres with good water and grass. The owner is looking to sell. I could build a house, run some cattle, make a real home." "Patrick, that is a dream come true," Lillian said. "You should do it." Patrick took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been building toward. "I want to do it," he said. "But not alone. Lillian, I want to build that home with you. I want to marry you if you will have me." Lillian's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Are you asking me to marry you, Patrick Irwin?" "I am," Patrick said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, nothing fancy, just a simple gold band with a small stone. "I know it is not much. And I know we have only known each other a few months. But I love you, Lillian. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Lillian said, and she was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes." Patrick slipped the ring onto her finger, and then they were kissing and holding each other and laughing with pure joy. The future spread out before them, full of possibilities and promise, and Patrick thought about how strange life was. How a blizzard and a moment of compassion had led him here, to this perfect moment with this perfect woman. They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the church in Helena. Most of the town turned out for it, and Lillian's students threw flowers as she and Patrick walked down the aisle. Lillian wore a white dress that the seamstress in town had made, and she looked so beautiful that Patrick forgot to breathe for a moment when he saw her. The minister spoke about love and commitment and building a life together, and Patrick and Lillian exchanged vows that they had written themselves. Patrick promised to always be honest with her, to support her dreams, to stand by her side through whatever challenges came their way. Lillian promised to love him with all her heart, to build a home with him, to be his partner in all things. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Patrick kissed Lillian with every ounce of love he felt for her, and the entire church erupted in applause. The reception was held at the town hall with food and music and dancing. Patrick danced with his wife, and the word sent a thrill through him every time he thought it. His wife, Lillian Irwin. She had taken his name, though she told him privately that she planned to keep using Zimmerman professionally as a teacher. Patrick told her he did not care what she called herself, as long as she stayed by his side. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in the same room where Patrick had first said goodbye to Lillian all those months ago. But this time there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. They belonged to each other now, in every way that mattered, and they celebrated their union with tenderness and passion and joy. In the morning, they began their new life together. Patrick had bought the land he had told Lillian about, and they spent the summer building their house. It was hard work, but they did most of it themselves with help from friends and neighbors. The house was small but sturdy, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a front room where they could sit in the evenings. Patrick built a barn for the horses and cattle, and Lillian planted a garden with vegetables and flowers. Lillian continued teaching during the school year, riding into town several times a week. Patrick worked the ranch, buying cattle and slowly building up his herd. It was a good life, full of hard work and simple pleasures. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains and talk about their day. They would lie in bed at night, wrapped in each other's arms and plan for the future. By their first anniversary, Lillian was pregnant. She told Patrick on a warm evening in June after they had finished dinner and were sitting on the porch. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and said, "There is a baby in there, our baby." Patrick looked at her with wonder and love and maybe a little fear. "A baby," he repeated. "Are you happy?" Lillian asked. "I am terrified," Patrick admitted. "But yes, I am so happy." The pregnancy was not easy. Lillian suffered from terrible nausea in the first few months, and she had to cut back on her teaching. But she refused to stop working entirely, and by the time she was showing, she was back to her full schedule. The children were fascinated by Miss Zimmerman's growing belly, and Lillian turned it into a science lesson about how babies develop. Patrick hovered over her like a nervous hen, driving Lillian to distraction. He tried to keep her from riding into town, from lifting anything heavy, from doing any of the chores she had always done. Lillian finally sat him down and told him in no uncertain terms that she was pregnant, not dying, and that if he did not stop treating her like she was made of glass, she was going to brain him with a frying pan. Patrick backed off, but he still worried. He had seen too many women die in childbirth, knew too well how dangerous it could be. But Lillian was strong and healthy, and the midwife in town assured them both that everything was progressing normally. Their son was born in late February 1884, during another snowstorm. It was not as bad as the blizzard where Patrick and Lillian had first met, but it was enough to keep them snowed in at the ranch. The midwife had come to stay with them a week earlier, anticipating that the baby would come soon, and it was a good thing she had. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Patrick thought he might lose his mind from fear and helplessness. But Lillian was brave and strong, and when the baby finally arrived just after dawn, his cries filled the small house with life and hope. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Lillian's arms. "A healthy baby boy." Patrick looked down at his wife and his son, at this tiny person they had created together, and felt something break open in his chest. Love, pure and overwhelming, flooded through him. "He is perfect," Lillian said, tears streaming down her face. "Patrick, he is perfect." "He is," Patrick agreed, running one finger gently over the baby's soft cheek. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months without reaching a decision. But now, looking at their son, Lillian said, "What about Samuel? After your grandfather, Samuel Irwin," Patrick said, testing the name. "I like it. Samuel Patrick Irwin." "Hello, Samuel," Lillian said to the baby. "Welcome to the world." The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and terrifying and wonderful. Samuel was a demanding baby, waking frequently to nurse and fuss. Patrick learned to change diapers and rock the baby to sleep and function on very little sleep. Lillian was up even more than he was, but she seemed to take to motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else. By summer, Things had settled into a routine. Lillian had taken a break from teaching to stay home with Samuel, but she planned to return to the school in the fall. Patrick hired a young woman from town to help with the baby and the house during the day. And slowly their life found a new normal. Patrick would come in from working the ranch to find Lillian on the porch with Samuel in her lap, reading to him from one of her books or singing him songs. Or he would wake in the night to hear her talking softly to the baby, telling him stories about his parents and how they had met. "You were born from a blizzard," Lillian would say. "Your father saved my life in a snowstorm, and 9 months later, you arrived in one. I think that means you are destined for greatness, little one." Patrick would lie in bed listening, his heart full, and think about how far they had come. From strangers caught in a storm to a family, united by love and choice and the simple act of sharing a blanket when it mattered most. The years passed, bringing both joys and challenges. The ranch prospered, and Patrick was able to expand his herd and buy more land. Lillian returned to teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in the territory. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. When Samuel was 3, Lillian became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born on a beautiful spring day in 1887. They named her Rose, and she had Lillian's dark hair and Patrick's blue eyes. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. 2 years later, another son arrived. They named him Thomas, and he was the calmest of the 3 children, content to watch the world with serious eyes. Patrick and Lillian now had a full house, loud and chaotic and filled with love. Montana became a state in 1889, and Helena remained the capital. The town continued to grow, and so did Patrick and Lillian's family and ranch. They added rooms to the house as the children grew, built a larger barn, fenced more pasture. Patrick took on a hired hand to help with the cattle, a young man named Jim who was steady and reliable. Lillian continued teaching, though she cut back her hours as the children got older. She loved her work, loved watching her students learn and grow. Many of the children she taught went on to do remarkable things, and Lillian was proud of every single one of them. But her greatest pride was her own children. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to be a veterinarian. Rose was spirited and independent, already talking about becoming a lawyer, even though everyone told her that was not a career for women. Thomas was quieter, more introspective, with a gift for music that surprised them all. In 1895, on a warm summer evening, Patrick and Lillian sat on the porch of their ranch house and watched their children play in the yard. Samuel was 15 now, tall and gangly, teaching Rose how to throw a lasso. Thomas, at 6, was sitting under a tree with a stick and some pebbles, creating some kind of percussion music. "You ever think about that night?" Lillian asked, leaning against Patrick's shoulder. "The blizzard." "All the time," Patrick said. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently if I had kept riding, if I had not heard you calling out, if the storm had been worse." "But you did not keep riding," Lillian said. "You came back for me. You shared your last blanket with a stranger." "And you shared your whole life with me," Patrick said. "That seems like a much bigger gift." "It was not a gift," Lillian said. "It was a choice, the best choice I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Patrick thought about the life they had built together, about the family they had created. It had not always been easy. There had been hard times, years when the cattle prices dropped or the weather was bad. There had been illnesses and injuries and all the normal struggles of life. But through it all they had had each other. "Thank you," Patrick said suddenly. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a cowboy you met in a blizzard. For building this life with me. Lillian lifted her head and kissed him softly. "Thank you for being the kind of man who would risk his own life to save a stranger, for being a good husband and father, for loving me the way you do. Always," Patrick promised, "for as long as I live." The children were older now and required less direct supervision. Samuel had gone off to university in the East to study veterinary medicine, making both Patrick and Lillian incredibly proud. Rose, at 13, was becoming quite the horsewoman and had declared her intention to help run the ranch. Thomas, at 10, had discovered a love for writing and spent hours with his nose in books or scribbling in his journal. In the evenings, after the work was done, Patrick and Lillian would often take walks around their property. The ranch had grown to over 400 acres now, with a substantial herd of cattle and several good horses. But what mattered most to Patrick was not the land or the animals or the house. It was the woman walking beside him, her hand warm in his, her presence a constant source of comfort and joy. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" Lillian asked during one of these walks. "In the line shack, I said a lot of things," Patrick replied. "Most of them probably stupid because I was half frozen." Lillian laughed. "You said that I was worth saving, that I was someone special." "You were," Patrick said. "You are. You barely knew me." "I knew enough," Patrick said. "Sometimes you just know, Lillian. You meet someone and something in your gut tells you that this person matters, that they are going to change your life. I felt that the moment I saw you standing in that snowdrift, trying to save your horse even though you were freezing to death yourself. I was so scared," Lillian admitted. "Not just of the storm, of everything. I had left my entire life behind, had no real plan, no idea what I was doing. And then you appeared, this stranger on a horse, and you helped me without asking for anything in return." "I got plenty in return," Patrick said. "I got you." They reached the creek that ran through their property, the same creek where Patrick had proposed all those years ago. The water was running high with spring snowmelt, clear and cold. Patrick and Lillian stood on the bank, watching the water flow past. "When I think about our life together," Lillian said thoughtfully, "I realize that everything we have built started with one simple act of kindness. You could have kept riding that day. You had every reason to. It would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, but you chose to help instead." "I could not have lived with myself if I had left you there," Patrick said. "And that is exactly why I fell in love with you," Lillian said. "Because you are the kind of man who chooses compassion over safety, who sees someone in need and cannot walk away. That is who you are, Patrick. That is who you have always been." Patrick pulled Lillian close, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They stood like that for a while, watching the water and the sky and the mountains in the distance. This land, this life, this woman. It was more than Patrick had ever dreamed of having. "I love you," he said. "More than I have words to say." "I love you too," Lillian replied. Today, tomorrow, always. By the turn of the century, Patrick and Lillian had been married for nearly 16 years. Samuel had graduated from veterinary school and returned to Montana, setting up a practice in Helena. He was courting a young woman named Elizabeth, and there was talk of a wedding in the spring. Rose had indeed become an invaluable part of running the ranch, with a natural skill for managing both cattle and people. Thomas had finished school and was working as a journalist for the local newspaper, writing stories about life in Montana. Patrick was 44 now, his hair starting to gray at the temples, his face weathered from years of working outdoors. Lillian was 41, still beautiful, still the smartest person Patrick had ever met. She had retired from teaching the year before, though she still volunteered at the school and tutored students who needed extra help. They had lived through blizzards and droughts, through good years and bad. They had watched their children grow and thrive. They had built something solid and lasting, not just in the ranch and the house, but in their relationship. They were partners in the truest sense, sharing the work and the decisions and the dreams. One evening in December, as snow fell softly outside their windows, Patrick and Lillian sat together in front of the fireplace. Rose and Thomas had both gone to a dance in town, and the house was quiet. Patrick held Lillian's hand, playing with the ring he had given her so many years ago. "Do you remember our first Christmas together?" Lillian asked. "The dance at the town hall," Patrick said. "You wore that green dress and taught me how to waltz." "You stepped on my toes 6 times," Lillian said, but she was smiling. "At least 6, Patrick agreed. "Probably more like 10. But you did not give up on me." "I have never given up on you," Lillian said. "Not in all these years. Even when you were being stubborn or difficult or making decisions I disagreed with, I never gave up." "And I have never given up on you," Patrick said. "We made promises to each other, Lillian. In that church, in front of everyone we knew, and I have kept those promises. I will always keep them." "I know," Lillian said softly. "That is why this works, because we both chose this. Every day we choose each other." Patrick kissed her then, slow and sweet, and thought about all the kisses they had shared over the years. Passionate kisses and tender kisses and quick kisses as they passed each other during the day. Each one a reaffirmation of their love, of their commitment to each other. "Come to bed," Lillian said when they pulled apart. "It is barely 8 o'clock," Patrick said. "I know," Lillian replied, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "But the house is empty and we are not getting any younger. I think we should take advantage of our privacy while we have it." Patrick laughed and let her pull him to his feet. They went to their bedroom, the room they had shared for all these years, and loved each other the way they always had. With tenderness and passion, with joy and commitment, with the deep knowledge that this was where they belonged. The years continued to roll forward, bringing changes and challenges. Samuel married Elizabeth, and they gave Patrick and Lillian their first grandchild, a beautiful baby girl they named Anna. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with the hired hand Jim, the steady young man who had been working on the ranch for nearly a decade. Patrick and Lillian gave them their blessing, and Rose and Jim were married in a small ceremony on the ranch. Thomas moved to San Francisco to work for a larger newspaper, chasing bigger stories and broader horizons. Patrick worried about him in that big city so far from home, but Lillian reminded him that their son was grown now and needed to find his own path. Patrick and Lillian grew older together, their hair turning silver, their faces lined with age. The ranch was mostly managed by Rose and Jim now, though Patrick still helped out when he could. Lillian spent her days reading, gardening, and doting on her grandchildren. They had 4 now, with more on the way. One winter evening, when Patrick was 65 and Lillian was 62, another snowstorm rolled through Montana. It was not as severe as the blizzard that had brought them together so many years ago, but it was enough to keep them inside for a few days. Patrick and Lillian sat together in front of the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if we had never met?" Lillian asked. "I try not to," Patrick said. "It is too sad to imagine." "I would have ended up married to that awful man," Lillian said. "Or maybe I would have found work teaching somewhere else, but I never would have had this life. This beautiful, full, wonderful life. And I would have kept drifting," Patrick said. "Moving from place to place, never putting down roots, I would have been alone." "But you are not alone," Lillian said. "Neither of us are. We have each other. We have our children and grandchildren. We have this home, this land, this life we built together." "Because I shared a blanket," Patrick said. "Because you cared enough to help a stranger," Lillian corrected. "And because I was brave enough to trust you. and because we both chose to turn that moment into something lasting. Patrick tightened his arms around his wife. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "Mine too," Lillian agreed. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the fire and the snow, holding each other close. Outside, the storm raged, but inside they were warm and safe and together. Just as they had been that night in the line shack so many years ago. Just as they would be for the rest of their lives. The storm passed, as storms always do. The snow melted, spring arrived, and life went on. Patrick and Lillian celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. There was a party at the ranch, with food and music and dancing. Patrick danced with Lillian, moving slowly and carefully now, but with no less love than he had felt 40 years before. 40 years, Lillian said, her head resting on Patrick's shoulder. "Who would have thought I would have," Patrick said. "From the moment I met you, I knew you were the one. I knew we would have a lifetime together. You could not have known that." "Maybe not with my head," Patrick admitted. "But with my heart, I knew. My heart has always known." They danced until the music stopped, until the guests began to leave, until it was just the two of them standing on their porch under a sky full of stars. The same stars that had been there the night they met. The same moon that had watched over them as they built their life together. "Thank you," Lillian said, "for 40 years of love, for 3 beautiful children and a growing brood of grandchildren, for this ranch, this home, this life. Thank you for being exactly who you are." "Thank you," Patrick replied, "for taking a chance on a cowboy, for choosing me every single day, for sharing your whole life with me when all I had to offer was a blanket." "It was enough," Lillian said. "It was more than enough." They went inside together, hand in hand, and prepared for bed. They moved slowly now, their bodies aged and tired, but their love was as strong as it had ever been. They lay down in their bed, the same bed they had shared for decades, and held each other close. "I love you," Patrick said, as he said every night. "I love you," Lillian replied, as she replied every night, and they drifted off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that they would wake up together. Today, tomorrow, and all the days that remained to them. Patrick lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer night. Lillian held his hand as he drew his last breath, tears streaming down her face, but also smiling because they had had so many good years together. So many wonderful years. She lived 4 more years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had saved her life in a blizzard and then spent the rest of his life making her happy. She told them about the line shack and the blanket and the night they had lain together in the darkness, keeping each other warm. "He was a good man," she would say. "The best man I ever knew, and I was lucky enough to be his wife." When Lillian passed away at the age of 86, she was buried next to Patrick on a hill overlooking their ranch. The whole community turned out for her funeral, and people told stories about the remarkable teacher who had educated generations of Montana children, the loving wife and mother and grandmother, the brave woman who had come west to forge her own path. But the story that was told most often, the one that became part of family legend, was the story of how Patrick and Lillian met. How a cowboy had shared his last blanket with a stranger in a blizzard. How a woman had shared her whole life in return. How a single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and created a legacy that would endure for generations. Their children and grandchildren would stand on that same hill, looking out over the ranch that Patrick and Lillian had built, and they would remember. They would remember that love starts with choosing to care, with putting someone else's needs before your own, with being willing to share what you have, even when it costs you something. They would remember that a life well lived is not measured in wealth or status or achievements, but in the love you give and the love you receive. In the family you build, the community you serve, the kindness you show to strangers. They would remember Patrick and Lillian, the cowboy and the teacher, who met in a storm and built a beautiful life together. Who proved that sometimes the greatest loves come from the smallest moments, that sometimes sharing a blanket is enough to change everything. That sometimes the best thing you can do is to stop and help someone who needs you, because you never know where that moment might lead. And on quiet winter nights, when the snow fell soft and white over Montana, the descendants of Patrick and Lillian Irwin would gather around their own fires, wrapped in their own blankets, and tell the story again. The story of the blizzard, the story of the blanket, the story of a love that began with compassion and grew into something extraordinary. A story that would never be forgotten, passed down through the generations, a reminder that the greatest legacy we can leave is not what we build or what we achieve, but how we love and how we care for each other in the darkness and the cold, when it matters most.